The United States is now at war with Iran. I know that some people watching this video will find that fact extremely scary. Others will find it extremely intriguing, and still others will find it extremely frustrating. But whatever we're approaching this video with, that set of facts remains true. The United States is now indeed at war with Iran, and timing is always a rather interesting thing. When I walked into this forest to film a video today, I was actually walking here to film a video about how the United States was preparing to go to war with Iran, based on several signals that myself and others have been seeing in the military space and also in the political space back at home in the United States, where it was very clear from multiple different angles that this is indeed what the United States was preparing to do. But I could never have known just how accurate that theory really was, because literally as I was walking down the trail, my phone went off with the notification that indeed the United States had just bombed Iran's nuclear facilities. So with that in mind, there are three primary questions that everybody seems to be asking about this. Number one is obviously, why did the United States do this in the first place? Why is the United States bombing Iran's nuclear infrastructure? Number two, are those reasons legitimate, or are they contrived and an excuse? That's a big debate that's going on in a lot of different areas. And number three, what is the ultimate outcome of all of this going to be? And should we be worried that a larger conflict will now start because of what has happened here? So the first question is, why is the United States bombing Iran's nuclear infrastructure in the first place? And as I approach this question, I am going to provide the stated reason for the United States taking these actions, and then I will examine whether or not I think that's valid in the next question. So the stated reason for the United States bombing Iran's nuclear infrastructure is that they believe Israel's intelligence that Iran is perhaps days or weeks away from assembling a functional nuclear warhead. And this, the United States and Israel both jointly see as a major threat. Because for decades, Iran has been threatening to wipe Israel off the map. And as a part of wiping Israel off the map, Iran has also threatened the United States. This is not news to anybody. These are things that have been discussed for years. But for whatever reason, Israel decided that now was the time to strike Iran's nuclear infrastructure and try to take it out before Iran could actually get a nuclear weapon. Now, you could argue that the United States, when these strikes first begun, did not know of or did not approve of Israel actually doing this, and we could argue back and forth. But the fact of the matter is that after Israel began to bomb Iran's infrastructure, the stage was now set, and the United States almost had to get involved. And the reason was that as Israel was bombing different nuclear targets and different military targets across Iran, they came across targets that they could not destroy with their own homegrown capabilities. And you could say, and correctly so, that Israel should have known this before they started bombing. Now, these targets that I'm talking about could only be destroyed by highly specialized bombs dropped by US stealth bombers and nothing else. And the reason that's the case is because these targets are buried deep underground, and they require special underground striking bunker busting bombs to actually reach those depths and sufficiently destroy the targets. The only other option would be perhaps a special forces operation going in on the ground to take the targets out. But that seems unlikely, if not impossible, because Israel is engaged now in active conflict with Iran, and they would not have the element of surprise necessary to actually carry out those strikes. That left only the B-2 stealth bombers if these targets were to be destroyed. And what that meant is that if the United States chose not to be involved, the outcome of these strikes on Iran would be predictable. What you would have would be an Iran that was deeply wounded but not completely defeated. An Iran with most of their nuclear facilities taken out, but not all of them. A potentially now very motivated Iran that, if the capabilities within the remaining facilities were sufficient, would likely and predictably move as fast as they possibly could to actually finish a nuclear weapon. So with that in mind, regardless of if they were actually intending to do that prior to Israel's strikes, this is why I say once Israel actually began striking Iranian facilities, the stage was set and the die was cast, and it was almost a certainty that the United States would ultimately get involved. So the question we now have to ask is, are these reasons actually legitimate? Was Iran actually close to developing and using a nuclear weapon? Or is this just an excuse that was being used to draw the world into a conflict where Iran's military capabilities would be destroyed? That is the debate that everybody is having right now. And of course, given recent history in the Middle East, it is actually a valid debate. Most people remember that when it came to the war in Iraq, nuclear weapons were used as the reason for the United States invading Iraq, the idea that Iraq had WMDs. And as it turned out, there were not actually WMDs in Iraq. This was actually an idea that was intentionally ceded to British intelligence by somebody from the Iraqi military who wanted to gain citizenship in Britain and wanted to use his intel about Iraqi nuclear weapons as a way to gain that citizenship. And so with Iraq being this conflict in the Middle East, where a country was actually invaded under false pretenses based on the idea of nuclear weapons, a lot of people feel maybe we're having deja vu and maybe the same thing is going on now. So it's important to analyze several elements on this and see what the most likely scenario is. Now, as we dive into this, obviously there are going to be a lot of competing narratives and a lot of different opinions. And my aim in this video is to fairly present the major sides while still having my own opinion, but also being fair to people who disagree with me. That could be difficult to do, though, in today's modern media landscape, where everything is so one-sided and often extremely biased. So before we dive into that, I wanted to introduce a sponsor of this channel that helps me with complex analysis like this, which is Ground News. Now, Ground News is really cool. What it does is that for any given topic, it helps surface all of the different articles related to that topic, so you can see how both sides are presenting the same information. And Ground News also makes it easy to analyze at the forefront what the different ideas are and make an assessment of potentially how valid those might be as you dive in. So, for example, on a subtopic related to today's topic that I'll discuss in just a moment, where we have Trump disagreeing with his spy chief over whether or not Iran is building a nuclear weapon, we see in Ground News that even at the headline level, there is a difference in sentiment depending on if the news source comes from the right or the left. Left-leaning headlines emphasize that Trump is shutting down or trashing Tulsi Gabbard, while right-leaning headlines simply say that Trump said she was wrong. Those are very different levels of disagreement, and the reality is obviously dependent on the actual words Trump used and not what the different headlines say. This is one example of why I like to use Ground News to see every side of a topic before forming my own opinions. And if you like watching this channel, I think you'll like Ground News too. So if you want to get started, you can do so by using the link in the description of this video, ground.news/Paul. And if you subscribe using my link, you'll actually be able to get 40% off a Vantage plan, which is what I use to get access to all of their features. So going back to our discussion of whether or not the nuclear reason for Israel and now the US bombing Iran is actually legitimate, there are a lot of different reasons that people are a little bit confused about this, and a lot of reasons that people are taking pause. And probably one of the biggest reasons is how much the narrative has seemingly changed over just a couple of days. When Israel first began bombing Iran, really just a couple of days ago, the United States' position was very different from what it actually is right now at this moment. At first, the United States was not openly condoning Israel's attacks on Iran, and the rest of the world really was saying that they did not believe that Israel's intelligence matched what they were seeing. Or at least they were saying that they could not corroborate that what Israel was saying about Iran being very close to developing a nuclear weapon was true. And in particular, Tulsi Gabbard, Trump's spy chief here in the United States, who is in charge of disseminating this type of information to a whole lot of people, including Trump, she was saying something similar. She was saying that she did not have intelligence that Iran was actually actively developing a nuclear weapon. And that created a lot of confusion because over the past couple of days, things have begun to shift, where now Donald Trump has come out saying that there is actually valid evidence and that actually Tulsi Gabbard was wrong. Now, what really happened here is not that Tulsi Gabbard was wrong. It was actually that she just didn't take the narrative and the evidence as far as Israel. What Tulsi Gabbard's intelligence said was that Iran did have the components to potentially build a nuclear weapon. That intelligence did not say, though, that Iran had actually made the decision to build a nuclear weapon, and it didn't seem to indicate that they were going to make the decision to build a nuclear weapon. So in a sense, it's a case of different people having different information and interpreting the information differently. Israel interprets Iran as having all of the necessary components to build a nuke, as we should strike now. The United States at first wanted to take pause, but of course now we've seen that that has shifted, and the United States has begun to bomb Iran. To me, this is very significant evidence that perhaps the nuclear argument might be legitimate. And the reason I say that is primarily this. Donald Trump, I do not believe necessarily wanted to bomb Iran, because the vast majority of Americans, and indeed the majority of Trump supporters, do not support the United States intervening in Israel's war against Iran. I think the last poll I checked, and this might have changed within 24 hours because things are developing, but the last poll I checked said that about 16% of US citizens actually supported intervention in Iran. Whereas roughly half, or more than half, a little more than half, actively opposed it, and the others were basically somewhere in between. They didn't have an opinion either way. So for Donald Trump, we see this being a very unpopular move, and not a move that I think he would be likely to make unless he thought there was a legitimate reason to do so. So in that case, it is quite possible that the nuclear question is legitimate. With that said, the timing is still interesting. And I've heard this timing interpreted a number of different ways, so I will just give you the timing and let you think it through on your own, and maybe I'll return to it when it's been a little longer and we have a little bit more data. But the timing of this is coming when the United States has been actively pursuing this new nuclear deal with Iran, and those talks seem to have been maybe breaking down, but they weren't quite over yet. It could be that Israel wasn't satisfied with the nuclear deal that the United States was pursuing with Iran, and they wanted to take advantage of this window of opportunity before the United States entered into an actual agreement to force what they saw as a more satisfying conclusion, which is, we want Iran's nuclear capabilities destroyed. We don't want there being any potential of them having their nuclear capabilities only restricted by something that's on a piece of paper. The other option could be that maybe those nuclear talks were not going as well as the United States had hoped, and maybe the United States communicated with Israel to take this approach instead. It's really hard to know, and probably, except for the people that were in those rooms making those decisions, we'll never know exactly. But there are a couple of different options on the table that make the timing of these strikes interesting. That said, what we should talk about next is not the past, but the future. Take our attention off now, who's to blame, and just ask ourselves what's possibly going to happen next. Because the truth is, whatever the reasons for this conflict starting, the United States is now at war with Iran. And what most people want to know is, how is this going to affect the world, and what is likely to happen next. And I know a lot of people are genuinely freaked out about this. I've already received a lot of texts from friends who aren't super involved in geopolitics, who don't follow this stuff a lot, who are legitimately worried that this could somehow escalate into World War III or into some massive type of war. And what I want to say from the forefront is I do not think that is a likely scenario at all. I just want to put your nerves at ease there. The other alternative is a massive regional war. That's what a lot of the news media has been talking about. That's a little bit more possible. A massive regional war in the Middle East, but I still think that that is highly unlikely. And I want to explain why. So why is a World War III scenario not very likely, especially at this time? And bluntly stated, the reason a World War III scenario is not very likely right now is because the military capabilities to fight in such a war simply do not exist, especially in Iran. When we look at what has happened in Iran over the course of just a couple of days, they have lost a huge portion of their major military facilities, and even more importantly, they have lost control over their own airspace, which is now dominated by the Israeli and I guess now the US militaries. This is a major point because domination over the opponent's airspace is something that, for example, Russia has been attempting to achieve in Ukraine for well over 3 years, and they have been unable to do so. Without Russia's ability to control Ukrainian airspace, they have become locked into a land war with Ukraine and have not really been able to move forward at all. Iran not only does not have control over Israel's airspace, they don't have control over their own airspace. And this makes it almost impossible for Iran to do anything significant in retaliation. Yes, they can send missiles towards Israel, which they are doing right now. They can send drones towards Israel, and some of those are going to reach their targets. That's to be expected. But Iran doesn't have the capability to escalate this beyond their own borders, and especially not to the United States or Europe. Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon yet. These strikes, whether you believe their reasoning or not, these strikes were done to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon. Pretty much nobody believes Iran actually has a nuclear weapon right now. So nuclear Armageddon is not really at all possible. The same sort of goes for a regional war in the Middle East, in my opinion. And in my opinion, that's part of the reason Israel chose to actually do this. Over the past several years, however you feel about Israel's war, it is still a fact that Israel has taken out a lot of Iran's proxies, whether that be Hamas, whether that be some Houthis, whether that be Hezbollah. And these are all of the ground forces that Iran would count on to actually engage in a war in the Middle East, particularly because Iran can't actually get troops to Israel without going through both Iraq and Syria, and those countries aren't going to be very happy about doing that. So from a military perspective, Iran isn't really capable of escalating this to the point where they would become a threat to anybody who's probably watching this video. And the same also goes for allies that might be willing to support Iran. Russia, Iran's biggest ally, has basically already backed out of even the idea of supporting Iran, because obviously Russia is fully engaged in their own conflict against Ukraine that they are slowly losing and definitely struggling to win. And so things can't escalate in that direction towards a world war either by getting Iran's allies and friends involved. So without a risk there is a risk from all of these strikes. And that risk isn't really to the physical safety of people, at least not most of the people watching this video. That risk is towards economic security. Because what Iran can do and might do is try to escalate attacks around the Persian Gulf and around the Red Sea, in particular two small choke points, one of which Iran is right next to, and one of which the Houthis, Iran's proxies, are next to, in order to prevent oil tankers traveling through those waters and delivering oil to the rest of the world. This would also potentially be able to block shipments coming through the Suez Canal and through the Red Sea, if enough effort was put there. And so these are really the worst possible things Iran can do. Their ability to achieve these goals is also really unlikely, and any disruptions would likely be temporary at best, because the United States is now positioning carrier groups around these areas to protect these things and to prevent these potential objectives and stoppages of global trade from actually happening. So we've covered why this conflict started, we've analyzed whether or not that seems legitimate, and we've looked at where the conflict might go. The next and last piece is to examine some of the broader implications of this conflict, and those are many. One of the really interesting things about what's going on here is that President Donald Trump in the United States is now ordering military strikes against a foreign opponent. And what's interesting about these orders and the language around it in so many ways is that Trump's actions are now in direct opposition to the words that Trump has been telling to Ukraine regarding its war against Russia for quite a long time. For example, Trump has come out and saying today that they are not interested in a ceasefire. The United States is not interested in a ceasefire. The United States is only interested in total victory, which is essentially what Ukraine has been trying to explain to the United States about Russia for a long time. That Ukraine, they would love to have a ceasefire, but they feel that a ceasefire puts them at existential threat, and so they're not willing to submit to a ceasefire unless certain terms are met. And now the United States finds itself in the uncomfortable position of having lectured Ukraine on that and now having to say the same things themselves. What are the broader implications of that? That remains to be seen. It could be that with the United States now going to war against Iran, which is allied with Russia, that the United States might at some point in the future be more willing to get actively involved in Ukraine's conflict against Russia, because the conflicts, even though they're geographically separated, are logically connected, with Iran providing weapons to Russia to use against Ukraine, etc. We're going to see probably a lot of very interesting political discussions happening here in the United States as people process and digest what's going on, and that could grow and extrapolate to regions beyond the Middle East. And in my opinion, that could be one of the most significant mid to long-term outcomes of all of this. One other phenomenon that we're already seeing, and that is just only going to grow, is some splits within the Republican Party in the United States over this conflict. I mentioned half of Americans don't support this war. Only 16% actively support it. Half of Trump supporters actively oppose getting involved in this war. And yet Trump is taking this step. And so what we're already seeing is people publicly going against Trump, saying he is not doing what they elected him to do, and even some spats between Trump and some extremely influential Republican commentators, with Trump having tweets against people like Tucker Carlson, for example. So we see the Republican Party is not only going to war with Iran, but it's now also going to war with itself, again, because the logic it is using in its war against Iran goes contrary to a lot of the logic that Trump used to get himself elected, where he talked about the war in Ukraine as just this warmongering and that the violence needs to stop. And yet now he's engaging in a war of his own, because in this situation, he recognizes that sometimes violence is necessary to stop violent people. And so I have no idea where that will go, but it's likely to go somewhere interesting. Now, if you found this analysis helpful or interesting, before you go, I am supported in large part by members of my community and viewers like you. So before you go, if you are interested in helping support the work I do here on this channel, you can consider becoming a patron. To learn more about that, just scan the QR code on screen or follow the link in the description of this video. With that in mind, don't forget to like and subscribe. That's completely free. Now here's a couple more videos on screen that I think you'll probably be interested in if you enjoyed this one.